Just before we start today's video, we want to bring you a message from our awesome sponsor, Unsolved Case Files from Goliath. I've been a big fan of the company Goliath for years. I absolutely love playing the game Sequence with my friends and family, so I was really excited when they sent me their game, Unsolved Case Files. It's an amazing puzzle game where you get to be the detective and solve a murder. Each game includes props like realistic newspaper clippings and crime scene photographs. Using the clues, you have to solve a murder. I was lucky enough to have Goliath send me one of their Unsolved Case File games, Who Murdered Harmony Ashcroft. On May 8, 1998, the night before her wedding, Harmony Ashcroft was murdered in her hometown of Riverdale, Indiana. Her body was found behind the restaurant where her wedding rehearsal was being held. Harmony was one of the most beloved young women in the town, and the residents wanted swift justice. Unfortunately, a local vagrant named Bones McBride was wrongly convicted of the murder. It's up to you to solve the murder and clear Bones McBride's name. Unsolved Case Files is a great game to play by yourself, or you can play with a group of people. It's for ages 14 and up. You can find a link to Unsolved Case Files, Who Murdered Harmony Ashcroft, in the description box below this video. Goliath also has many more Unsolved Case Files, so you should check them out as well. Number 3. Alissa Turney. In July 2017, we released the video 5 Haunting Unsolved Disappearances Part 2. It has gone on to be one of our most watched videos. In the video, we cover the disappearance of 17-year-old Alissa Turney, who lived in Phoenix, Arizona. May 17, 2001 was the last day of Alissa's junior year at school. Alissa's stepfather, Michael Turney, claims that he picked Alissa up from school and they went out for lunch. Michael had adopted Alissa and her younger sister, Sarah, 9 years earlier after their mother died of cancer. Michael said that during lunch, Alissa became angry because she wanted to have more freedom, and he said that wasn't going to happen. After lunch, Michael took Alissa home. He left the house around 1 p.m., leaving Alissa home alone. That night, Alissa was planning on going to a party. Michael claimed they ran some errands over the next several hours and they picked up Alissa's 12-year-old sister, Sarah. When they got home, Alissa wasn't there. In Alissa's room, there was a note in Alissa's handwriting that was addressed to Sarah and Michael. It reads, "Dad and Sarah, when you dropped me off at school today, I decided I am really going to California. Sarah, you said you didn't want me around. Look, you got it. I'm gone. That's why I saved my money. Dad, I took $300 from you." That night, Michael called the police and reported Sarah as a runaway. There wasn't immediate suspicion of foul play because Alissa had an aunt in California and she had talked about going out there because she and Michael didn't get along. A week later, Michael said that he got a strange phone call from a telephone number in California. He couldn't hear the caller, but he thought it was Alissa. However, he said that her voice sounded different. Michael filed a missing persons report that night. But the police didn't investigate the disappearance because they thought Alissa had just run away and she would return home at any time. But the rest of Alissa's family and friends had become seriously concerned about her. Alissa was close with Sarah. She had several close friends and a steady boyfriend, and none of them had heard from her. Also, while Alissa had thought about running away, she had never told anyone that she was definitely going to run away. Another problem is that she didn't take some things a young woman would have taken if she was moving to a different state. This included her cell phone, makeup, and hairbrush. Plus, she had $1,800 in her bank account, and her bank account had not been touched since she went missing. One person who was definitely worried was Sarah. A week after Alissa went missing, Sarah started a website asking for leads and tips. Unfortunately, weeks, months, and then years went by without anyone hearing from Alissa. In 2006, 5 years after Alissa vanished, a convicted murderer named Thomas Heimer wanted to talk to the authorities about her disappearance. Heimer had been arrested in Georgia about 7 months after Alissa went missing. Heimer, who was 26, had been traveling with a 30-year-old companion named Sandra Goodman. Goodman's dead body was found under a motel bed in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. She had been strangled and stabbed to death. In 2006, Heimer mailed letters to several police departments around the country proclaiming to be a serial killer, saying they had killed 21 women whose bodies were never found. He claimed that one of his victims was Alissa Turney. When the police investigated his claims, they concluded that he was lying about killing Alissa. He then took a polygraph exam, which confirmed he wasn't telling the truth. It's unclear if Heimer was responsible for any of the 21 murders he took responsibility for, or if he was just doing it for attention. He has never been charged with any other murders. Although Heimer didn't kill Alissa, his false confession did have a tremendous effect on her case. It kickstarted the investigation because the police realized that Alissa probably had not run away. The police thought that Michael Turney, the last person to see Alissa alive, was the most obvious suspect. Michael was a strict disciplinarian who wanted to control Alissa and Sarah. He would go through their computers and phones and record all incoming and outgoing calls. Michael also set up surveillance cameras both inside and outside the house. Some of the cameras inside the house were hidden and no one knew that they were there. The police started asking around, and several people said that they believed that Michael had been sexually abusing Alissa for years. A year before Alissa went missing, Michael did something unusual. He called Child Protective Services and told them that if Alissa did call and accuse him of sexual abuse, they shouldn't believe her. The police also learned that Michael wrote strange contracts which he made Alissa sign. One contract, dated a year before she went missing, stated that Michael had not sexually abused her and Alissa had signed it. Based on the allegations and Michael's behavior, the police developed a theory regarding motive. Alissa had threatened to go to the authorities regarding the years of sexual abuse, so he killed her and disposed of her body. The police tried to interview Michael, but he refused to cooperate. He would correspond with them, but it would only be over the phone or via email. He flat out refused to take a polygraph exam. One thing the police knew was that Michael had security cameras around the property. They wanted to know if he had any footage from the day Alissa went missing. He said he did and he had reviewed it, but it didn't show anything of interest. The police asked to see it and he refused to give the footage to the police. Instead, he gave them some clips recorded months before Alissa went missing. It showed Alissa talking to some teenage boys at the house. The police asked Michael for a sample of his DNA, and once again, he refused to cooperate. At this point, Michael was looking very suspicious, and the police were getting frustrated with his lack of cooperation. So they got a court order to get a sample of his DNA. On December 11, 2008, they executed the search warrant. When they got inside his home, they were shocked by what they found. There were 26 homemade bombs and 19 high-caliber rifles. Also, a van parked on the property was rigged with gas canisters so that the van would burst into flames. The neighborhood was immediately evacuated and the explosives were cleared out. Michael was arrested on weapons charges. Once the house was deemed safe to enter, the police searched the house. They found video footage of Alissa that went back into the 1980s. Oddly enough, the footage from the day Alissa vanished wasn't found. They also found the strange contracts that Alissa had signed. One odd thing that was found was a 98-page manifesto written by Michael entitled Diary of a Madman Martyr. In the manifesto, Michael wrote that assassins from the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers murdered Alissa. Michael became an electrician in the 1980s. In 1992, he got injured, and in 1993, he was laid off. 3 weeks after being laid off, his wife and Alissa and Sarah's mother died from cancer. But why would the union want to kill Alissa? According to the manifesto, it was because Michael had complained about safety conditions. In retaliation for his complaints, the union kidnapped Alissa, killed her, and buried her in the California desert. Michael also claimed they had killed 2 union assassins, but he was going to get the ultimate revenge. He was going to drive his van, armed with the bombs, into the union meeting hall during a meeting. He was going to shoot as many people as he could and then detonate the bombs. The police thought that their timing was incredibly lucky. The next union meeting was on December 15th, and they searched his house on December 11th. Michael initially said that the bombs weren't his and they were planted there by the police. Michael admitted that he planned on dying by suicide, but he claimed he only wanted to do it because he wanted to bring attention to Alissa's case. But in March 2010, 62-year-old Michael Turney admitted in court that the bombs belonged to him. He pleaded guilty to unlawful possession of unregistered destructive devices. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Unfortunately, none of this helped with Alissa's case. In August 2017, Michael was released from prison. One person who was determined to keep Alissa's story in the media spotlight was her younger sister Sarah. She even emailed us in March 2018 asking if we could feature Alissa's story without knowing we had already covered it less than a year earlier. Sarah told us that she had read the police interviews. She told us that at least 24 people, including a teacher, said that Alissa had told them that Michael was abusing her. She also said she confronted her father and he said many crazy and incriminating things. But what stuck with her was when he said, "Be there at the deathbed and I'll give you all the honest answers you want to hear. I'm just saying, hang around." Sarah thought that this was as good as a confession, but the police didn't think so. Sarah had also made Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter accounts with the username Justice for Alissa. She also spent a year raising money for a billboard. In September 2019, 8 years after her sister went missing, Sarah launched the podcast Voices for Justice. The podcast features 29 episodes related to Alissa's disappearance. Sarah wrote the episodes based on 3,000 pages from the police investigation, and it tells the most complete story of Alissa's case. Then, during the COVID-19 quarantine, Sarah decided to download TikTok to help pass the time. She then started making TikTok videos talking about her sister's case. She soon had 10 million likes and over 800,000 subscribers. Sarah's TikTok activity helped get Alissa's case back into the spotlight. But more importantly, it also got the wheels of justice turning. In June 2020, the Phoenix Police presented their case to the district attorney. The district attorney presented the case to the grand jury. On August 19, 2020, 19 years after Alissa went missing, the grand jury indicted Michael Turney on one count of second-degree murder, a Class 1 felony. Michael was arrested the next day in Mesa, Arizona. At a press conference, the district attorney credited Sarah with keeping the case in the spotlight. She said that Sarah's constant campaigning was a testament to love of a sister. Because of that love, Alissa's light has never gone out. Sarah is still producing her podcast, Voices for Justice. She has moved on from her sister's case and covers other unsolved murders and disappearances. It's a brilliant podcast, and if you're looking for something to listen to, we definitely recommend checking it out. There's a link to her podcast in the description box below this video. Michael Turney has yet to go to trial for second-degree murder. Number 2. Stanley Park's Babes in the Woods. In one of our earliest videos, 5 Unsolved Murders of Siblings, which went live in April 2017, we discussed the case of Stanley Park's Babes in the Woods. Stanley Park is a 1,001-acre park in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. The park was home to one of Canada's most baffling mysteries. On January 15, 1953, a gardener was working in the park and he found a small human skull. He immediately alerted the police. The area where the skull was found was searched. The police found the bones of 2 young children. Initially, it was believed to be the remains of a boy and a girl, and they were probably between the ages of 6 and 10. Near the remains, a small hatchet was found. One of the skulls had a marking from the hatchet's blade, and the other skull had a marking from the blunt side of the hatchet. The police concluded that the children were led into the park where they were killed with the hatchet. Also found around the remains were a woman's coat, a single woman's shoe, a rusted metal lunchbox, bits of children's clothes, 2 child-sized leather aviator caps that resembled caps worn by pilots during World War II, and 2 pairs of children's shoes. It's believed that after the children were killed, the coat was placed over their bodies. The police learned that the shoes were imported into Canada after World War II. So the police theorized that the children weren't killed before September 1945. Based on the amount of leaves and other vegetation on the bodies, they thought that the 2 kids were killed 6 years earlier in 1947. The biggest problem for the investigators was that the children didn't match any missing persons reports. So at the time, this made identifying them impossible. Since the police didn't know the children's identity, they had a serious lack of suspects. The people of Vancouver were disturbed that 2 young children could have been missing for at least 6 years and no one noticed. But it wasn't long before the case went cold. It wasn't until the 1990s that the case was reopened and progress was made on the case. One of the first things that was done was that the bones were sent for DNA testing. The DNA results provided some answers to the identity of the children. The first is that they were the bones of 2 boys, not a boy and a girl. Secondly, they were half-brothers who shared the same mother. Also, they were thought to be between the ages of 5 and 8. The cold case investigator also learned that the shoes were available in Canada during World War II. Also, the police using the fallen leaves to determine how long the bodies had been there wasn't an exact science. All this caused problems in the investigation because the police were looking for witnesses who saw something suspicious involving a young boy and a young girl in 1947. So the cold case investigator began looking through older case files. In 1944, he found something notable. 2 witnesses said a man and a woman were in the park with 2 boys. The couple was noticeable because the man was carrying a hatchet and he banged it on the metal railing as he walked. But then, a short time later, the couple was seen again, but the 2 boys were no longer with them. Also, the woman was only wearing 1 shoe and it was covered in blood. So the cold case investigator believed that the boys were actually murdered in 1944. But beyond that, he had no idea who the boys were and who killed them. Then in May 2021, the police sent samples of the DNA to Redgrave Research Forensic Services, a Massachusetts-based forensic genetic genealogist company. Several months later, in February 2022, the police announced that the case was officially closed. The boys were identified as David and Derek Dalton. They were killed in 1948, about 5 years before they were found. David was 6 years old and Derek was 7. The police narrowed in on that time frame based on evidence like school records. The half-brothers were from a family of Russian immigrants that came to Canada in the early 20th century. The two brothers lived in poverty for their entire lives. The police talked to the family, who changed their last name to Bousquet in the 1950s. They said no one ever spoke about the boys' disappearance. The boy's mother was a woman named Eileen Bousquet. Decades after the boys went missing, Eileen's great-great-granddaughter found a photo of her grandmother with two boys she didn't recognize. Her grandmother told her that the boys were taken away from her mother by social services. After that, they never saw them again. Eileen died in 1996 at the age of 78. The police believe that she killed her sons. Otherwise, why didn't she report them missing? Also, since a woman's coat was draped over them and a woman's shoe was found under the remains, it is believed that a woman killed them. However, Eileen's family remembers her as sweet and maternal, and they do not think she could have killed her two sons with a hatchet. Nevertheless, after nearly 7 decades, the police consider the Babes in the Woods case closed. Number 1. The Durhams. In June 2021, we posted the video 3 Unsolved Murders of Families, Part 3. In the video, we cover the strange case of the Durham family. In November 1969, the Durham family moved to Boone, North Carolina. Boone had a population of about 9,000 people. The Durhams lived on a hilltop in an upper middle-class neighborhood. They moved to the small town after Bryce Durham purchased the Buick Pontiac dealership in town. In early 1972, 51-year-old Bryce lived with his 44-year-old wife, Virginia, and their 18-year-old son, Bobby. Bryce and Virginia also had a daughter, 19-year-old Ginny. Ginny didn't live with the rest of the family. Against the wishes of her parents, she married a man named Troy Hall, and they lived in a trailer about 4 miles from the family's home. Virginia worked as a bookkeeper at the dealership, and she helped run it. Bobby was attending Appalachian State University, which is in Boone. On the night of February 3, 1972, there was a snowstorm in the area. 4 inches of snow fell, and winds reached speeds of up to 40 miles per hour. Bryce attended a Rotary meeting at a nearby ski resort. When he left, the weather was terrible, and everyone from the meeting drove behind him. Bryce pulled into the car dealership at about 8:30 p.m. Virginia and Bobby were both there. Bobby went to classes that day. When classes were finished, he drove to the dealership because it was closer to the university than their home. Bryce had just gotten a 4-wheel drive vehicle, a GMC Jimmy, and the family drove home in that. A neighbor noted that they got home at about 9 p.m. The neighbor knew the time because they got home around the time of the start of the 9 o'clock movie. They had suspected that around 10 p.m., the 3 family members were sitting in the living room, watching TV and eating a snack. Ginny and Troy were also at home watching TV that night. At about 10:30, Troy and Ginny's phone rang, and Troy answered it. The caller's voice was muffled, but he thought it was his mother-in-law, Virginia. Virginia said something to the effect of 4 African-American men were beating up Bobby and Bryce. Then the line went dead. Troy thought that the call was a bizarre prank. Ginny didn't think her mother would pull a prank, especially one that dark. Ginny then convinced Troy that they should drive over. But there was a problem. Their car wouldn't start. So they asked a neighbor, who was a private detective, to drive them, and he agreed. When the trio arrived at the Durham home, Troy and the neighbor went inside while Ginny stayed in the car. The house had been ransacked. They heard some water running in the bathtub. They went into the bathroom and found the dead bodies of 51-year-old Bryce, 44-year-old Virginia, and 18-year-old Bobby. Their bodies were resting on the ledge of the bathtub, shoulder to shoulder, and their heads were submerged in the water. The water was still running and flooding the bathroom. Troy and the private detective went to phone the police, and they discovered that the phone had been ripped out of the wall. So they went to a neighbor's home and called the police. The bodies were pulled out of the tub. There were rope burns on their necks and wrists. A loose cord was still tied around Bryce's neck, but no other rope was found in the house. The medical examiner determined that Bryce had suffered a blunt force trauma wound and Virginia had been struck in the face. The police found blood splatter on the living room wall. Virginia's cause of death was strangulation. Both Bobby and Bryce had died from a combination of strangulation and drowning. Initially, because the house had been ransacked, the police believed that the family had been killed during a robbery. But several obvious valuable things were left behind. For example, there was a bank deposit bag with several $100s in it sitting out in the open. The vehicle the family drove that night, the GMC Jimmy, wasn't parked in the driveway. The police found it abandoned on the side of the road about a mile from the family's home. Inside the vehicle, there was a pillowcase with some silverware from the family's home. The police tried to figure out what happened after the family returned home. It is believed that at about 10 p.m., the family was in the living room watching TV and they were eating. When the police arrived, the TV was still on and they found partially eaten food in the living room. Then a person or people somehow entered the home. There were no signs of forced entry or break-in. The person or people were able to overpower the family and kill them. In April 1972, about 2 months after the murders, the police made 4 arrests. They were 4 white men, 21-year-old Dewey Coffey, 28-year-old Jerry Quesada, 22-year-old Eugene Guerin, and 20-year-old Dean Chandler. But the charges against the 4 men were soon dropped due to a lack of evidence. After that, the case went cold. The police did have several theories regarding the murders. One theory was that they were killed in a robbery. But since nothing of value was stolen, they thought that this was unlikely. The prevailing theory was that Bryce and Virginia's son-in-law, Troy Hall, committed the murders. The police thought that Ginny was possibly involved, or she may have ordered the murders. The motive was that Bryce and Virginia didn't approve of their relationship, so they decided to retaliate. Or they possibly killed the family to get the inheritance money. The police questioned Troy and Ginny. Like Bobby, Troy was a student at Appalachian State University. Troy told the police that he went to the campus library at about 5 p.m. that night. He stepped outside around 8 p.m. and talked to a friend. He got home at about 10 p.m. and Ginny was there. Ginny had been at home all night. Troy said that when he got home, they watched some TV. The Olympics were on, so they watched that. But after 10 or 15 minutes, they lost the TV signal because of the weather. So they started listening to a record. At about 10:30, Virginia called and they said they were being attacked by 4 black men. After the call went dead, they went to the house and found the dead bodies. The police thought that this was an incredibly odd story. The first thing that they found strange was the phone call. If there was a home invasion and Virginia made it to the phone, why did she call her daughter and son-in-law who lived 4 miles away? Why not call 911 or the police? Why did she make the call at all? Why didn't she run from the house? Also, Troy and his mother-in-law were not close. Could he have recognized her voice? The sheriff at the time of the murders did not believe that the call ever happened. Another reason the police suspected Troy and Ginny committed the murders is that there were no signs of a break-in or forced entry. Ginny had keys to the house, so she could have let them in or given Troy the keys. Or he could have taken them without her knowing. Another problem is that Troy and Ginny didn't have a good alibi for the time of the murders. No one could account for where they were between 9 and 10:30 when the murders were committed. But there were also problems with the theory that Troy and Ginny committed the murders. For example, could Troy have committed the murders by himself? Bobby was an 18-year-old college football player, and it would have been difficult for Troy to strangle and drown him by himself. Also, it's not likely that Bryce and Virginia would have done nothing while their son was being murdered. It's possible that Ginny helped, but she was described as slight, so it's doubtful she would have been physically helpful during the mass murder. Other elements suggest that at least 2 strong people were involved in the murders. Notably, if the phone call did happen, Virginia said it was 4 men. Secondly was the way the men were killed. They were both strangled and drowned, which probably happened one of 2 ways. The first is that their head was held underwater while they were still conscious. Even if their hands were tied up, it would have taken a lot of strength and determination to drown someone like that. The second way is that Bryce and Bobby were strangled into unconsciousness and then their heads were placed under the water. For one person to strangle each family member one by one with a rope would have been time-consuming and taken a lot of energy. Then, moving someone who is unconscious can be difficult because they are heavy and awkward. So could one person have strangled all 3 people to the point of unconsciousness, or in the case of Virginia, to death, then drag and carry their bodies to the bathroom, and then place their bodies over the ledge of the tub so that their heads were submerged in water? What makes more sense is that at least 2 people committed the murders. The cars are also clues that at least 2 people were involved in the murders. It was a snowstorm that night, so it's assumed that the killer or killers didn't walk to the family's home. Yet the family's GMC Jimmy was driven away from the crime scene. It's most likely that the driver of the first car picked up the person or people who drove away in the GMC. It is possible that Ginny drove one of the cars, but as we just discussed, it seems unlikely that she was physically involved in the murder of her family. It is also possible that Troy had a physically strong accomplice with him, but the police never found any possible accomplices. Ginny and Troy always claimed that they were innocent, but suspicion hung over their heads. They ended up moving out of the county after the murders. 4 years after the murders, they got divorced. Troy eventually became a lawyer. He ended up selling in Georgia, and he owned a construction company. Ginny remarried, and she and her second husband moved to Washington State. The police looked at other theories regarding the murders. For example, it could have been a professional hit. After all, the murders were methodical and carried out with precision. 3 people were bound and murdered without a gun being fired or anyone being stabbed. Then all the bodies were meticulously placed next to each other in the bathtub, with their shoulders touching. But why would anyone want the family murdered? There were rumors that in the former county where the Durhams lived, Surrey County, South Carolina, car dealers were rolling back odometers. Supposedly, Bryce revealed the identities of the ringleaders to the authorities. But the police never found any validity to this theory. So for nearly 5 decades, the case was cold. Then in February 2022, 50 years after the murders, the police announced that the case had been solved. The break in the case came in May 2019. A man named Shane Bird had paid a visit to the sheriff's department in White County, Georgia. White County is about 24 miles from the Georgia-North Carolina border. Shane was visiting the sheriff's office to help with research about notorious crimes that happened in Georgia. Shane's father, Billy Sunday Burt, was a notorious criminal who was a member of the Dixie Mafia. The Dixie Mafia is a loose criminal network that is involved in bootlegging, whiskey running, arson, bombings, illegal gambling, bank robberies, and murder for hire. The network has strong ties to Biloxi, Mississippi. Shane always had a close relationship with his father, and he regularly visited him in prison. Billy had died in prison at the age of 79 in April 2017. In May 2019, Shane told the investigators about one visit he had with his father. His father mentioned killing 3 people in the North Carolina mountains during a snowstorm. Because of the snowstorm, they nearly got caught. The information was passed along to the sheriff's office in Watauga County, which is where Boone is located. They ended up interviewing Shane. Shane told them that he believed a man named Billy Wayne Davis was also involved in the murders. Davis was still alive and in prison. In September 2019, October 2020, and August 2021, investigators talked to Davis. Davis confirmed that he was involved in the murders of the Durhams and Billy Burt was one of the killers. He also said 2 other men were involved in the murders, Bobby Jean Gaddis and Charles David Reed. Gaddis died in prison in 2007 around the age of 65. Reed also died in prison, but it's not clear when he died. The sheriff's department said that they used evidence to verify Davis's statements. The 4 men had a long history of violence and murder. In December 1973, nearly a year after the murders of the Durhams, 75-year-old Reed Oliver Fleming, who went by his initials, R.O., and his wife, 71-year-old Lois, lived in Rennes, Georgia. R.O. had owned a Ford dealership, but he had recently retired. However, he was still dealing in used cars. On December 23, 1973, R.O. didn't show up to teach Sunday school. His son went to their home and found it ransacked. In the bedroom, he found the dead bodies of his parents. They both had been bound with electrical wire and then strangled to death with clothes hangers. Several months later, in April 1974, Billy Burt, Bobby Gaddis, and Billy Davis were arrested for a bank robbery that happened a month earlier in Walton County, Georgia. Davis turned state witness and confessed to robbing the bank. He testified against Billy Burt and Bobby Gaddis. Billy and Gaddis were found guilty. Davis was sentenced to 20 years in prison, and the other 2 men were sentenced to 25 years in prison. But Davis wasn't finished confessing. He said that Billy, Gaddis, and Charles Reed killed the Flemings. He had stayed in the car while the 3 men went inside. All 3 men were indicted for the murders. Billy Burt went to trial for the murders of the Flemings in June 1975. Davis testified against him, and he was given immunity for his role in the crime. The trial lasted 6 days, and Billy was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death. Gaddis went to trial in August 1975. He was also found guilty and sentenced to death. Charles Reed was the last to go to trial. He was found guilty and he was given 4 life sentences. But the police were far from finished from connecting the 4 men to other crimes. In April 1974, Davis led the police to the body of 24-year-old Otis Riedling Jr. Riedling was last seen alive in November 1972. His body was buried on the banks of the Mulberry River. He had been shot once. Davis said that Billy Burt had killed him. However, neither Billy nor Davis were charged with this murder. In August 1975, Billy Byrd confessed to a double homicide. On May 7, 1971, a married couple who were pathologists, 69-year-old Warren and 60-year-old Rosina Matthews, were shot to death in their home in Marietta, Georgia. Between 1973 and 1975, 7 men were convicted of those murders. 6 of the men were sentenced to life in prison and 1 was sentenced to death. The men were known as the Marietta Seven. But then in June 1975, their convictions were overturned because an appeal showed that evidence had been suppressed. All 7 men were released after their convictions were overturned. A couple months later, in August 1975, Billy confessed to the murders of the Matthews and said that Billy Davis worked with him. In September 1975, Billy and Davis were indicted on several crimes, but it wasn't for the murders of the Matthews. One was a home invasion that happened in December 1970. The couple who lived in the home were bound and robbed, but ultimately left alive. In December 1971, 35-year-old Charles Max Sibley was shot to death in a home invasion in Lithia Springs, Georgia. In August 1976, Davis went to trial for the murder of Charles Max Sibley. Billy testified that Davis paid him $5,000 to kill Sibley. Billy said that Davis owed Sibley $14,000 in gambling debts. Davis was found guilty and he was sentenced to life in prison. Billy was never tried for the murder of Charles Max Sibley. In the summer of 1979, Davis and Billy Byrd were indicted for the murders of the Matthews. Davis went to trial in October 1979. He was found not guilty. After that, the district attorney chose not to try Billy, who was already on death row. But that same month, Davis led the police to another body buried on the banks of the Mulberry River. It was the body of Donald Chancey, a small-time bootlegger who went missing in July 1972. Chancey had been shot once in the head. Davis said that Bobby Gaddis and Billy Byrd killed him, so they were charged with his murder. Gaddis made a plea deal and testified against Billy in exchange for immunity. Billy went to trial for the murder of Donald Chancey in February 1980, and he was found guilty. He was given a life sentence. Although Billy had been linked to 6 murders, he was only convicted of 3, the murders of the Flemings and Donald Chancey. One sheriff believed that Billy was responsible for more than 56 murders, and this was before he was linked to the murders of the Durhams. By all accounts, Billy Sunday Byrd was a complex individual. Although it's suspected he killed dozens of people, he was very charismatic. He was a loving husband and father. He was so likable that he became friends with the sheriff who believed he killed 56 people. The sheriff ended up playing Santa Claus to Billy's children. Billy Byrd and Bobby Gaddis stayed on death row until March 1997, and then their sentences were commuted to life in prison. Gaddis died in 2007, and Billy died in April 2017. Billy Davis told the police that the Durhams were murdered because someone had hired them to kill the family. However, Davis doesn't know who hired them, he wouldn't tell, or since he's in his early 80s and the crime happened 50 years earlier, he may have forgotten. One person the police wanted to talk to after Davis's confessions was Troy Hall. The police believe it's possible he may have paid for the hit. After all, elements of the phone call still don't make sense. Like, why did Virginia call them instead of 911? Could Troy have recognized her voice? Also, why did Virginia say it was 4 black men when all the home invaders were white? Unfortunately, we may never know the answers to these questions. Troy Hall died in December 2019 before the police had a chance to talk to him. We may never know who hired the assassins or why the family was condemned to death. Ginny, who is still alive, thanked the investigators for their decades of work, and she said she is happy that the case was finally solved. Thank you so much for watching today's video. And now, here's a clip from our latest video from our new channel, Paranormally Listed. One day, she came across a Bigfoot eating the buds off her plants. Initially, she wanted to run because she was afraid of him. But she decided to stand her ground because that crop was her livelihood. So she pointed her shotgun at the Bigfoot. The Bigfoot put his hands in the air. Then Nancy looked down and saw Bigfoot's genitals. It was clear that he was sexually aroused. Nancy said it had been a while since she had sex, and she was impressed with Bigfoot's penis. Nancy said that she's not sure what happened next, but it turned into an adult movie. She said she didn't know who started it, but he ended up having sex with her from behind. You can find a link to the rest of the video on the screen now. There is also a link to the channel in the description box below this video. Thanks again for watching.